Our next presentation is by Urvashi Agarwal. She will be speaking on remembering, repeating and working through the Indian girl child.
Urvashi is currently doing her MPhil in psychotherapy and clinical practice from Ambedkar University, Delhi, and is using infant observation in her paper.
This paper needed to be written because so much of our experience at Ambedkar University's MPhil in Psychotherapy and Clinical Thinking illustrates the title of the conference. A course on infant observation made something come alive about the continuity between my childhood and my present. It made clear to me why psychoanalysis talks about childhood. It drew a link between who I am today and how I was as an infant, and gave a context to my developing identity, which otherwise was threatening to become decontextualized and too individualized. This paper is an attempt to show how a training course, an individual student's childhood, and the experience of observing a baby in a family came together to illustrate a particular facet of the culture we live in, a theme that Sudhir Kakar alluded to in his work, The Inner World, 30 years ago, the ambivalence towards the girl child. The paper sees itself as providing evidence for how this rejection or ambivalence is played out in the ordinary interactions of a family, where without obvious trauma or abuse, the girl child may be treated differently enough for it to reverberate with an observer. We used the model given by Bick in 1964, where it was required that the students make an arrangement with the family to observe a baby every week for an hour for a period of about 6 months, and to record afterwards in as much detail as possible a description of what we saw. A seminar group composed of MPhil students and the seminar leader discussed and reflected on an observation each week. The experience of infant observation was the first of its kind for me. From setting it up to the actual observations, it was both exciting as well as surprising. The process was new, out of the ordinary. Observation had to be such that the senses needed to take over. I had to let the dailiness continue around me while I tried to be a fly on the wall. The family was an upper middle class family living in a joint family setup. The home was a 3-bedroom apartment on the 2nd floor. The baby's father was the elder of the 2 brothers that lived together along with their parents. The baby had a brother who was about 4 years old. Her chacha, that's the paternal uncle, and chachi, his wife, had a son who was about 3 months old when I started observations. I had approached the family through the chachi, initially expecting to observe her son. When I contacted the family, they were awaiting the arrival of a new baby. The possibility of observing a newborn had made me choose the baby girl. My observations began with the theme of rejection, where I rejected the chachi's son for the newborn girl. Throughout my observations, I remained acutely aware of my guilt for doing so and the chachi's sense of rejection vis-a-vis me. The first time I met the mother, she dismissed her infant girl in favor of her son. While she was only mildly curious to know what I would be doing in my observations, she insistently wanted me to know that she might not be able to tell me anything about her baby, since her preoccupation was her son, as he was feeling left out. The baby was only 19 days old at that time. What happened to the primary maternal preoccupation that Winnicott talks about? As she spoke, she referred to the baby as a he. I was confused. Wasn't the baby a girl? My visits ended abruptly after 3 observations. When I returned to the setup, it was only after a gap of about 4 months. How did this happen? In the initial few weeks, the mother was unavailable. She left the city to go to her mother's home once the 40-day postnatal confinement period came to an end. On other occasions, the mother would not allow me to come if the men of the house were at home, or even in the evenings when her son would be back from school. I struggled to fix observations with her, and each week seemed like starting all over again. It was only after presenting and discussing in the seminar did I realize my own hesitation in going back. I was apprehensive of the mother. Her inability to keep me in mind repeatedly made me feel rejected, and I felt my presence was intrusive and burdensome on her, while I experienced her as distant and unavailable. It was not just the difficulty of reaching her on the phone. Even when I was physically present, there was barely any interaction with her. I would usually find some other family member in the living room when I entered the home. The aunt, who seemed to feel personally responsible for my presence, would greet me and immediately get me something to drink and eat despite my protests. The mother would greet me only with a look, rarely to include a smile. Many times she would leave me to observe the baby while she attended to other tasks, and if she were in the room, I would feel uncomfortable and under pressure. At times when with the baby, either feeding, putting her to sleep, or attending to her in some other manner, I would try and ask her some questions about it. She would always respond to me, but there was never any curiosity to know anything from me or about me. I felt ignored, and when I look back at my experience, I have this gnawing sense that my presence in the house was barely registered. Rustin in 1989 writes, and I'm quoting her, "Where the choice has already been made to be a therapist, the exposure to intense feelings, the impact of feeling oneself drawn into an emotional force field, and struggling to hold one's balance and sense of self, the encounter with the probably unfamiliar confusion and power of infantile emotional life are especially valuable aspects of infant observation for beginning therapists. These aspects of learning are linked with Bjorn's distinction between learning about an intellectual activity and learning from experience, which is a form of knowledge imbued with emotional depth." Erik Erikson, in his paper The Nature of Clinical Evidence, says that the psychotherapist shares with all clinicians a further requirement that even while facing most intimate and emotional matters, he must maintain intellectual inner contact with his conceptual models, however crude they may be. But more than any other clinician, the psychotherapist must include in his field of observation a specific self-awareness in the very act of perceiving his patient's actions and reactions. He also says that the evidence is not all in if he does not succeeding in using his own emotional responses during a clinical encounter as an evidential source and as a guide in intervention, instead of putting them aside with a spurious claim to an unassailable objectivity. I would now like to present excerpts from my first 3 observations, where the lack of attunement between the mother and the baby left me significantly disturbed. This is at 19 days. The nanny asked the mother if she should do the massage, and the mother said yes. The nanny went inside the bedroom where the baby was sleeping. A few minutes later, the mother suggested that we go in as well. The nanny wanted the baby to pee before she began the massage and took her to the bathroom. I could hear her making peeing sounds. The baby was crying softly. The nanny then came out saying that the baby had not peed. She put the baby on the bed and started to tie a nappy. As the mother lifted the baby up, she realized that the nappy was wet. As the baby lay after the feed, she turned on her side and started to fall asleep. The mother said that she had started to sleep on her side and she put her on her back again. The baby began to cry and the mother put her on her side and patted her, but she kept crying. The mother lifted the baby and she became quiet. Earlier, during the feed, the baby had started to fall asleep and the mother had gently prodded her cheeks and said to the baby that he can't sleep right now. As the nanny returned, the mother gave the baby to her and asked her to make her pee again. The nanny took her to the bathroom and the baby was now crying more loudly. Through the massage, the baby cried continuously and the nanny lifted her several times to soothe her. Both the mother and the nanny commented on how her sleep had been disturbed and which is why she was crying. She looked sleepy. After the massage, the baby was wrapped in a blanket and handed to the mother. Both the mother and the nanny again commented on how sleepy the baby was. As the nanny took her for a bath, the baby was crying again. I told the mother that I would like to leave now. She said that if I wanted, I could stay longer and wondered if I was getting bored. When I returned from this observation, I was aware of my eagerness in having begun observations and yet feeling some numbness. At 33 days, the baby was lying quietly in the rocker. The chachi was talking to me, and soon enough, the baby began to whine. The chachi lifted her out of the rocker and held her, saying, "Pata chal gaya, गोद में नहीं है." She then asked that potty ki hai and checked her nappy, but it was clean. She then touched the baby's stomach, pressed it, and asked, "तुम्हारे भी पेट में दर्द है भैया की तरह?" So she compared it to her son's state, who had a stomachache at that time also. The baby whimpered a bit. The baby was left in the rocker and was put to sleep. The grandmother, who was now sitting there, got up and left, and once the baby was asleep, the house had become relatively quiet. For the next 25 minutes, I sat watching the baby sleep. Just as the hour was about to be up, the mother came out of her room with the massaging lady, who asked the mother if she should wake the baby up. The mother said yes. I realized that the baby would now be woken up for her massage. The baby was taken to the bedroom and the mother invited me in. I indicated that the hour was up and I would like to leave. She nodded and I fled. That I needed to flee only became apparent to me through the discussions in the seminar. I became aware of the distress I had felt in my first 3 observations, and I also realized that I was not alone in feeling the distress. It was reflected and validated by the group's response, where the presentation sparked discomfort in many of my classmates and the seminar leader. After the first 3 observations and discussions, it took me 4 months to return. The role of the observer in infant observation is tricky. The observer has to maintain a detached involvement in the setting such that she allows herself to be emotionally present in the setup, but is not actively trying to direct the happenings, much like a clinical situation. But here the observer does not form a part of the dyad. However, Rustin writes that how the experience of watching the feeding, bathing, holding, and total responses of a mother to her new infant takes the observer to some of the most vulnerable moments in the lives of them both. Feelings are often not just near the surface, but bursting out. Further, the position of observer removes the active role which adults expect to have in the presence of an infant, and this absence leaves a space in which the infant's sensations have a more intense impact. The context of the observation becomes one in which the observer's own infantile self will be painfully stimulated by the observation of a mother-baby couple. Memories and unconscious feeling of her own experience as a baby, of fears and wishes about herself as a mother, actual or potential, will be aroused. The profound distress that I experienced during the observations, and subsequently my inability to go back to the observation setting, came to my notice more sharply because of the persistent discomfort and irritability that I felt during the infant observation seminar and even while writing. Clearly, there was a reason this was becoming so difficult. I knew I was identifying with the infant, the helplessness that I experienced her as feeling, and her rejection, which was reflected in her mother's lack of attunement. For the first time, I became aware, acutely so, of the infant that I was. That before I became an adult, I was an infant. But this is a matter of fact. Why then do I need to state it like this? Maybe because the infant me feels like another existence, another person. As I become curious, I search for memories. What I come upon is only a mass of sensations, formless yet full. And all I feel like doing then is to curl up and sleep. Winnicott in 1991 says early descriptions of body states also become like early descriptions of emotional states. There is no thought and they exist at the level of sensations. So these parts exist in me, so familiar yet so forgotten, in my bones and in my body. And it is this which has allowed me to think about the infant that I was, the girl child that I became, and the woman that I am. It is in this context that I can make sense of the initial momentary hesitation and disappointment that I had when I realized that the infant I would be observing was a girl and not a boy. I am only too aware of my struggle to stay in the mother's mind, and how, after my return to the household, towards the end of observations, 3 months after the break, the pleasure I felt when she recognized me when I called her. Why was it so important for me? I wondered whether this was the baby's experience whose mother had decided to not keep her in mind. I also noticed that I had great difficulty in naming the baby. In writing my observations, I could never find the right name for her. Not surprisingly, I did not know her name till I went back to the household after the 4 months gap. I think I struggled to see the infant just as she struggled to be noticed in the house in her mother's mind. It was only when I could accept my infant self that I was able to accept her. When I returned to the observations, I saw the infant to be more robust and demanding, and it was a relief for me to see her like that. Something had shifted. When I began writing after my observations ended, the name came easily, and for the rest of the paper, she becomes Jaya. The image that stays with me is of the 5th observation when Jaya was 5 months old. As I entered the home, the mother said that she will take another 10 minutes because she was putting her son to sleep. I nodded and followed her to the living room, where the grandfather was sitting with the Chachi's son, Shan. He was nearly 8 months old now. After a while, the mother asked the maid to put Jaya in her chair in front of me. The mother went inside the kitchen, and the maid handed Jaya one of Shan's toys which she grasped and then waved about a bit. I could see Jaya's eyes follow the interaction happening between the grandfather and Shan, and she had a very surprised look on her face. She gave out a small squeal. He commented that she loves to scream and draw attention to herself. Jaya lifted both her arms in the air as if suggesting that she should be lifted. Through the entire sequence of interactions, the grandfather noticed her attempts but made no attempt to lift Jaya into his arms. While this might not be so significant on its own, as I sat observing the interaction, I could not help but feel a desperation to be held. Over time, through several observations, my continuing sense was that Jaya was too often left alone, all by herself. Even if this was not true in a physical sense, I felt that the engagement with her was largely a response to her biological needs, and there was hardly any play. While I always saw the Chachi's son in the grandmother's or his mother's arms, Jaya was rarely held, despite the acknowledgement that she loves to be held in your arms. At times, I wondered if the observation situation caused her to be left alone with me. On several occasions, I was unable to resist the urge to respond to her when she was with me. Jaya lay looking at me and smiled, and I could not help but smile back. She stretched her hands towards me and had a slightly sad look on her face, and I felt she was wondering why am I sitting and not holding her. I felt very drawn, and I stretched my fingers towards her and touched her fingers with mine. She smiled. The mother returned and put Jaya back in a sitting position. My sense was that Jaya's struggle to mark her presence in the house and my labor to be held in mind was a consequence of gender. In comparison to the attention the boys and the men of the family received, I felt the girl had to squeal for attention and love. I felt that there was a considerable difference in the mother's aliveness, in her response to her son as compared to her daughter. When the mother showed me the photograph kept on her dresser, which was of when her son was a baby, I was able to receive that only with mixed feelings. As I lived the infantile states, I also wondered about this mother that I experienced. Who was the infant that she was attending to, the son or the girl? And why was it so difficult for her to allow the baby girl to become her preoccupation? What about the infant in her? I realized that the mother herself was a shadowy presence in the house, more on the outside than the inside, never the center of attention. For her to be a mother to this infant, did she not also need to tussle with the infant girl in her? How had she been seen? Had she been seen as much as she would have liked? As a female, I was looked at with much amusement when I would tell people about infant observation, whether they were my own relatives and friends or Jaya's grandmother and aunt. Their immediate reaction was that I would not need to observe another's baby if I had my own. The idea of infant observation was unnatural, more so for a woman. These moments made me feel not only like an outsider, but more like an untouchable. While the response is not surprising, it also makes me aware of how central gender is in how we are received, whether it is at the time of birth or years later as adults in adult roles. This becomes more pronounced in a joint family system, especially in India. I never met Jaya's father, and I'm left wondering about the father's response to the birth of a daughter. On my last visit to the household, the mother and I spoke about illnesses in both our families. She had become aware of my grandfather's illness through the chachi. She then spoke about her father and his illness and of the many father figures whom she had lost to various diseases. I wondered how fragile her own sense of being a daughter may be in the face of her father's illness. At the same time, I wonder if, for the mother, a response to a baby girl becomes doubly challenging because it becomes nearly impossible to separate her own infantile self from that of her baby. Soa in 1999 suggests that at some point the mother must consciously and unconsciously acknowledge that she knows very little of this creature who has landed in her arms, and she is thrown into a state of using all at her disposal to figure things out. This would include her imagination, a part of which is her projective and introjective fantasies. If she can manage the feelings from her own infancy and her experience of her own mother, this may help. Thus, her response to a girl is marked by not only how she was seen and held as a baby, but also as an adolescent girl and as a young woman. And now, as a daughter-in-law, wife, and mother of a son, how she is made to feel about giving birth to a girl all become crucial in determining how she experiences and engages with her baby girl. Thus, what the mother brings to the infant in every contact that she makes with her is not only her own fears, anxieties, and needs, but those held and felt across generations. The attitude of a society, the collective abortion of the girl child. The theme of rejection or ambivalence of the girl child is not restricted to any particular class or caste, and the ubiquity of it in our times is beyond question. From the patients we see in the low-fee community clinic at AUD to my own experience to be allowed to exist as a single woman with a profession but not a marriage, the struggle is everywhere. The setting of the observation ensures a certain immersion in experience. When I entered the setup, I was a student of psychoanalytic thinking, wanting to observe infants and learn about early emotional development. When I left the setup, I was an Indian girl child. Psychoanalysis urges us to look inwards at our own demons and desire. In the process, I had forgotten that I belonged to a family, to a society, and to a culture with its own demons and desires. Winnicott said that he spoke in sessions only to let the patient know that he was awake and listening. I write this paper only because I have awoken to my history, which does not belong just to me, but to all of us, the shared history of a culture. I do not exist in vacuum, nor does my family, and neither do the patients we see. I'm quoting Ginaculus here, who says that in 1926, Freud pointed out that as a result of the long period of helplessness and dependence of the human infant, the influence of the real external world upon it is intensified and an early differentiation between the ego and the id is promoted. This raises the question of how the reality of the parents, which includes their psychic life as individuals and as a couple, can interact with and shape the emerging qualities of the child's fantasies. Further, most modern theories of self-development, like Fonagy and Taji in 1998, they all assume that the infant becomes a thinker of thoughts, a feeler of emotions, first in the mind of the caregiver, and when this is represented to her, she can experience it as herself. When a whole culture is unable to allow for the being of the girl child, when her arrival is met with depression, her presence is always a burden and her desire an unimaginable threat, many times this discrimination and rejection is not overt. It is so subtle because each of us are carrying within us the depression, the burden, and the threat, and unconsciously caressing the other with it. In my hesitation, I had rejected not only the infant baby, but myself. What then can be my desire for my girl child? Psychoanalysis is unique in that it sees affect as both the means and an end to themselves. This is especially true for infantile states where feeling states are formless and in a flux, forever shifting in texture and form, elusive and indeterminate. The link to the past is only the emotions that we feel in the present. Maybe then what we need to do as a culture is to find this missing link, to go to the infantile ages of our culture to see what we have collectively denied when we forget the girl child, to remember what we continue to repeat endlessly, to be born again. Thank you.
Thank you, Urvashi.
Thank you, Urvashi. I think that was a wonderful paper. I can't just help but thinking two things. One is that all the 5 papers that we have had, I have referred to the girl child, to problems that women face in India, 3 papers yesterday and 2 today. But also that what you said seems to unite all that we have been talking about since today morning. It seems almost like a response to the paper that came before you, Mansi's, but also especially to what Ken was talking about. That where does hope reside? Yeah? Where does hope reside in this? When will the girl child go to Jerusalem? And through whom will she go to Jerusalem? And maybe we have found the answer. Yeah? Maybe she go through Urvashi to Jerusalem. Good.
Thank you. Some more questions or comments? Anoop?
Professional questioners, please rise up.
Anu has a question. Anu has a...
Yeah. So I really liked the, the bringing it back to yourself. We don't live in a vacuum. That part was just something that really hit. Because we as, I don't know, maybe in AUD, but we're kind of rebels and we move out of the system but every day you get reminded that you're a part of it. It's not a vacuum. You can't just. So that was just something that that I really liked. And one more was the last line about what would I do with my daughter. That was, it's good too. Thank you.
I don't have a question, comment. I love the presentation of the paper. This a mixture of the I and the outside and the inside. It was a very much a writer's paper, and I wish there were more analysts who would write like that. So I really like the presentation again.
Thank you.
Can I speak without a mic? Because the mic is taking long, that's why. I think just a small urging in line with what Dr. Kakkar has said. Don't drop
The mic has reached you.
Don't drop the male child. Make an observation on him and his mother's interaction with him. The ambivalence is enshrined as a principle. So we must also go to that in order to evoke greater hope in ourselves as an agency of ours.
But that may be too rushed.
No, I'm not saying right now, but don't drop.
Right now.
Don't drop.
The chair is at the back. Right behind you. Hani has a question.
No, I don't have. No, I just want to share my feelings on listening to you. I thought it was a beautiful, very evocative, and complete in itself rendering of your work. Also, I must congratulate Nupur in taking this course through. Yeah,
opened a double pride, one with Nupur and one with you. Also, I thought that, for me, listening to your paper was like listening to Amrita's paper all over again, and then listening to Mansi and then to you, and listening in light historical context, beginning with women's sexuality yesterday, and then with women's childhood, and then with women's infancy. So, the three papers can also be read as one paper together. So, that was...
I'm kind of stimulated to say something that Anurag mentioned. I wasn't there yesterday, but Anurag said that 3 papers yesterday and 2 papers today all talk about a critical state of women in India. And Mansi also talked a while back about girl children and the problems that they have to live with. And she mentioned also about the necessity to work with mothers and with women. And now Ashok said something that don't drop men. I think I would actually like to pick that up and say that I think it's important for us to start working with men, and very young. They need to understand women. So that's what I just
Yes.
Some more thoughts or questions? Yeah, we need to have.
Throughout the paper, while I could travel back to some of my own experiences as a girl child, I was somehow drawn to what was happening to the little boy that was in the house, and what was happening between you and him. And somehow that sort of preoccupied me. That in our own, sort of connecting with our own losses, we're also creating an experience of loss somewhere. That's something which I thought, I don't know.
I think I was very aware of my guilt vis-a-vis the mother-son couple to start with, where every time there would be something that would make me look away, and I kept telling myself, I'm here to observe the other baby, I can't look at him, and I'm taking something away from my baby when I look at him. That was my feeling. That's as much as I can say, I think.
I'm just sort of curious also when you talked about how you will be as a mother to a girl child. I'm also curious of how that will get sort of played out if there is a son and the mother kind of connects with the loss that she's experienced being a daughter.
So,
Vinendra wants to say something.
No, Honorable wants me to say something. Please comment if you want.
I can't say from a woman's perspective. You wanted to say something.
you want to speak from a, would you like to?
No.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.